All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome on. I'll give it a couple minutes. We'll let some people join, and then we'll get this started at 5:30. Today is intermediate cameras. We will start the class at about 5:30. All right. It looks like it is 5:30 now. Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Saxon. I'm your camera class host, and today is the second Thursday of the month, March 13th. So today we will be doing intermediate cameras. Let me pull all this up. Thanks for joining me, who's ever on today. To really get into it, let me minimize this a little bit so I can see. There we go. All right. Perfect. Thanks everybody for joining. So today's intermediate cameras, and I get questions a lot about what this exactly means. What are we going to discuss? So if we review from last week, it was intro to cameras. We talked about buttons, where they live on the camera, what the buttons do. We talked about the differences between mirrorless and DSLR. We talked about the fact of how to go about thinking of lenses, what they do, what it acquaints to. And then we ended the class talking a little bit about content creation and ways to get into that without maybe breaking the bank. Today, though, we want to graduate a little bit further along the process. We want to get away from shooting on automatic and doing the base settings on the camera. We want to be a little bit more sophisticated, and we want to use the camera more as a tool. Again, the idea behind this is that cameras nowadays have gotten a lot more advanced. They work really amazingly on the automatic settings. When DSLRs and digital cameras really hit the market in the very beginning, the automatic settings weren't the best, and therefore really forced the user to learn manual control and the way that we go about changing and updating things. As time went on and phones became more popular, we see that phone cameras really give us the push to not need manual control. Therefore, the shift in the camera industry moved into these digital cameras that are gorgeous, high-powered, have great execution. However, if you only use them on automatic settings, are still a little limited. So that's what we're going to get into today, is really understanding what the difference and how that works, getting to know the controls. From there, then, we're going to talk a little bit about some photos at the end. I'll tell you what I think is in there, how I think the photo was taken, and what settings were used. But without further ado, let's get into things. So why do we want to go more advanced on point-and-shoot DSLR or mirrorless? I said it before, I'll say it again. It's to use the camera in its full functionality and up to its full potential. The camera can do a lot that you might not necessarily know about, but by learning that manual control, by understanding it a little bit better, and by just experimenting and practicing, there's a lot more that you can unlock on the camera that just goes past setting it to auto and shooting and taking a picture. I like to use this example for why I think using manual control is important, and I consider that a snapshot versus a photograph. A snapshot is something you might do on automatic controls of your camera. It's meant to be easy, breezy, nothing too complicated or out of the ordinary. The idea is that you, the user, are getting some sort of potential out of the camera, and you're getting a good image. Hi there. Sorry?
Oh, is this for the
Camera class?
Yeah.
Yeah, we just started. Have a seat. We teach it online and in person.
Oh, I didn't know you were online.
Yeah. So we have our little set schedule for it. So yeah, we go through the same every month.
Funny. Okay, I could have done that. All right.
All good. Do you want a water bottle while you're here?
I have a walk one.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now what we're doing is we're just talking a little bit more about manual control. Today is the intermediate camera class.
Okay.
So we're going to be learning about shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Just literally started this, so you're one slide in.
Okay.
Right now what I'm trying to talk to you a little bit about is the difference between a snapshot and a photograph. A snapshot, I think, is something that's more automatic on the camera. It's meant to be very simplistic and simple, whereas its counterpart, a photograph, can be a little bit more complex and detailed. Using the manual controls of the camera, you can really articulate a little bit better, more drama, more definition, really whatever it is that you're trying to get out of the camera. And so that's really what we're going to be jumping off from in this point, is what is the difference between that, how do we learn these manual controls and settings, how they are all separate, but then they all come together to give us that manual experience. So again, what I look at as a snapshot is a quick, easy picture. We're not really trying to get anything too complex. You might take this picture, send it to your friends, tell them this is where I'm standing by, or this is what I just saw. Versus a photograph, we actually go through the controls. And this is an unedited photo. This is just a picture that I took on my camera using the manual controls of my camera to make sure that I pulled out more definition, lightened things up, focused on the right spots that I wanted to, level the photo out so it looks proper, and just try to get something that was really clean. Step one, as we talked about last week, was learning your camera. Since I made this slide about 2 years ago, there are probably about 10 new cameras for each of these categories. The camera world is evolving constantly. New products are always coming out. There will always be new stuff to learn about. YouTube's a great resource, the camera manuals, your local camera stores, myself, my colleagues down in Small Electronics. They're all good resources for you to go to learn about your camera, understand your product, but just having that general knowledge of where buttons are and what they do will go a long way, especially as we start to learn these controls and how to use the camera in a manual setting. The mode dial is going to be the jumping off point before we get into the manual control. As we talked about last week with the mode dial, it's kind of like your gear shift in your car. It's how you go from park, neutral, reverse, drive, similar boat of how this mode dial works on your camera. This can switch you between auto and all of the other settings and functions that it has. And it's kind of important to know what those letters mean. The most important out of the mode dial are these guys. So last week what I recommended is that we stick with automatic. Learn and just use the basic settings of the camera. That's where you point, you shoot, you take the photo. The camera does all the work for you as far as the controls and the settings work. This way it simplifies things, it gives you the ease of use, and it lets you just focus on taking a pretty picture. And I think that's a really important starting point for a lot of photographers. A lot of people just try to jump into all these crazy controls without understanding how it works and what to look for. Program auto is then the next step. Program auto is still automatic, so shutter, ISO, aperture, the three most important parts of your photo, all stay the same. However, on program auto, we can now change certain things. We can play with exposure compensation, we can play with our focusing parameters, our targeting, we can focus on light metering, we can change our actual size of our image. There's a lot of things that we can do in program auto while still maintaining the base set of automatic settings. Aperture priority, shutter priority, and full manual is where we really get into the nitty-gritty of a camera. Aperture priority is just control over the aperture, which we'll talk about in a second. Shutter priority is the same, but only for the shutter. And full manual, now we take things from program, aperture, and shutter, and they're all mixed under one, under the full manual. And that's where now you are really choosing and dictating what your camera is doing based on what you see. To really understand all of this, we're going to talk about the exposure triangle. Now, I chose this chart as for my example of this. Only reason being is that when we do the triangle shape that you'll typically see in photography textbooks or classes, it can get a little confusing because people think if you go one way up the triangle, then you got to go this way. And I don't think that's necessarily true. It's important, and what we're mainly going to focus on is talking about all three separate, and then I'll show some photos at the end and we'll talk about them all together. But if we can understand this, it'll then help understand why we have to change certain things as we're shooting to get the best image possible. So we'll start with aperture priority, or just aperture. When we think about aperture, the way that we can look at it is like our eyeball. If you are sleeping, you wake up, you go to the bathroom, it's 2 in the morning, it's been dark in your room, you flip that light switch on, it burns like crazy when the light hits your eye. The reason being is that when you're asleep and you're in constant darkness, the iris of your eye gets larger, it expands. So when we turn that light on in the bathroom, there's that startle, that shock, it hurts. In the same way of cameras, where the lens is connected to the body, there's called an iris on the camera. That iris is dictated by these f-stop numbers. The lower the number, and we're going to call this true maximum or the maximum aperture, the more open this is, or the lower the number is, the more open everything is on the iris. Meaning that's the most amount of light you can let into the camera, and that's also your foreground and background separation. If we look at f/22, for example, the iris is very small. It's a very small little gray circle in the center there, but we can clearly see pyramids and a stick figure. So our foreground and our background are put together, are almost glued, so that way we get kind of that whole shot, if you will. As we lower the number, we're slowly but surely blurring out the background. So by going to the maximum aperture from a 22 down to 1.4, you can see that the background continues to get lost until our subject, our person in the photo, is the only thing in focus. Where this matters would be a great example of portrait photography, vacation photography, family events, whatever it might be. If you and your family are visiting a foreign country, let's say you guys are standing in front of a basilica in Rome, you might want to get a picture with the background and them in it. So using the higher numbers, f/22, 16, 11, that sort of thing might be more appropriate. But let's say you just had a newborn in the family, you just want to take a clean portrait, they're laying on some blankets, you're setting up a nice photo shoot. Maybe getting closer to that f/1.4, 2 or 2.8 to blur the background out, just focusing on your subject matter might be a better bet for you. And that's where the manual control of aperture comes into it, but there's a couple things to keep in mind with that. So here are some examples that I like to use. And we'll flip back to the chart so we can really see those in action as well too. If we look at the dog on our left, we can see the dog's nose is in perfect focus. We can see all the details, the whiskers, the little bit of snot that's there. We can also see a dog in the background. However, the dog in the background isn't necessarily that crisp. In my opinion, you can't really see where its eyes are going. You can see the pink collar, so I assume it's a lady. But that's really all the only information that we have. So if we look at that image and we go back to our chart, we're probably sitting somewhere around that f8, possibly even f11, where the background's slightly blurred, but our main focus or our main subject in the front is still visible. If that makes sense. If we go back and we look at the squirrel, the background is almost completely gone. The green is giving us that kind of example that, okay, there's probably shrubbery, a tree, something behind it that's foliage of some sort, but our squirrel and a little bit of the piece of wood that it's sitting on is the main focus. So if we go back, we're probably looking somewhere closer now in that range of f2 to f1.4. Where we're completely blurring out the background. We're getting little to no information, but the main purpose of that photo is to capture the subject matter. Something else to keep in mind too, when we switch these apertures, if we're doing something that's more, let's say f/22, f/16, f/11, where it's a higher number, but we're getting the foreground and the background, we get a deep image, something where we can see all the way back into the image, not just the main subject matter. Because our iris on our camera is so small technically, we have a darker image as a whole, and that's reflected on the dog. You can see the shadows, the eye is really tough to see, parts underneath the head are a little bit darker than they should be. There's not a lot of light that the camera's capturing on this, which will then make the image darker. That's where the balance then comes into play. Now, if we switch, now this is probably closer to that 1.4, maybe 2. our background is shallow, meaning it's blurred out. We barely can see anything behind the dog. The dog is still in focus. But do we see how much lighter the dog is? The eye has more coloration to it. The fur isn't as deep and dark in all the different spots. We still do have shadow coming down around the dog's neck and by the mouth, but the fur is significantly lighter on the shallow side than on the deep side. That's a trade-off with it as well too. So keep that in mind as you're playing with aperture and you're using it. You'll see the difference between the two. That being said, why would we want to use aperture priority mode or manual mode of aperture? And I think this image is really nice to explain that. You go out with your family, your wife, your girlfriend, your niece, whatever it might be, cousin, and you want to take a nice photo with a beautiful background and scenery kind of involved in there. Using something closer to the f22, 16, and 11 will give you something closer to this type of image. You've got good sunlight coming from the back, so light can hit the camera. However, now you're capturing and encapsulating both the background and the foreground. Now let's say maybe she was standing behind the rocks and there wasn't such a beautiful background. Well, then maybe you wouldn't want to focus on the whole thing. Instead, you change it down to like a 1.4 or 2 and just focus in on your subject. That's the beautiful part about aperture priority is that ISO and shutter are being controlled by our camera. All we're doing is controlling how much light is coming in and more specifically that foreground to background relationship that we're getting from whatever it is we're taking a photo of. On to the next one, which would be shutter priority, or shutter speed. There is a mechanical shutter on the inside of our cameras. The way I look at it is if you ever watch the movies, that little clapper tool that they use where they'll say, okay, in action, that's kind of like what your shutter really is. Your shutter comes down and at a certain speed, whatever you set it to, then captures your image. This in conjunction with f-stop and ISO is very important in how we get the picture. The way to look at it is that the slower that the shutter speed goes, the better for still or frozen photography type work it is. The faster a subject is going, the faster we should have the shutter speed going in order to make sure that we can capture and kind of frame that image. If we look at the stick figure that's on this chart right now, it's basically running, right? Let's say it's running a 5K, you go out to support a family member, a friend, you want to take some photos of them so that way you can show them later. Using speeds that are faster, the way that we read this is 1/500th of a second. That 1 is the second, and then that would be 500ths of that second. So typically when it comes to action movement, we want to use faster speeds or bigger numbers in order to freeze that movement. If we have an object or a thing that's moving slower or not moving at all, we can go with slower speeds. Now, if we're just looking at somebody who's running or action is happening, we can see that by slowing down, we get blurry, kind of pixelated images. That's something to be aware of when shooting. Typically, the faster the moving object is, the better or the faster you want your camera to be. And the slower the object, the slower you can run your shutter, but we'll talk about some of the problems that can occur if you go too slow. And for anybody watching online, and you as well, chime in at any point, interrupt, ask any questions you may have. For anybody online, chat away, ask any questions that you have as well too, I'll answer. When it comes to very fast objects, so like in this case we have a surfer hitting a big wave, is moving very quickly, 1 in 1,000th or faster of a second is a better speed to have. So if you've got kids that are running track and field, or you're going to a baseball game or a football game, that person that's running around the bases or running down the sideline isn't going to be easy to capture if you're using a 1/500th or a 1/250th of a second. Using and setting something to a faster speed is going to be much more desirable to make sure we freeze the frame. We can still see movement on the water itself, but when we look at the surfer, even from a distance and close up, we can see that we've frozen them perfectly to at least capture a really nice and fun image in this case. By capturing stuff like this, by using faster speeds, a little bit of blur is never a bad thing. And a lot of people get upset about it sometimes when they see, but it really does give a sense of motion. And we can see that really nicely in this hummingbird, woodpecker, either way. We can see the wings are blurry, but we can see the color of the bird is gorgeous. The yellows, the browns, the blues, the greens. He's got this really reddish orange, pink beak. There's a bug right in the middle there. So we've frozen the speed. These things move very quickly, but by setting our shutter speed to a higher number, we're having a better chance of capturing an image like this in motion without disturbing or without giving us a bad result at the very end. So a little bit of blur is never a bad thing. It can give a little bit of a sense of motion to it. Never be scared of it, but never be trying to seek blur. There are a lot of artists out there that have made a lot of money on blurry images. We are not that artist. We're just trying to get good pictures and get a better understanding of what these controls of our camera do. Now, when it comes to shutter, we've been talking about the fast speed of it, right? We've been talking about using the 1 in 1,000th, 1 in 500th of a second, 1 in 250th of a second. But there also is the ability to do long exposures. That's just you setting your camera on, let's say, a 5-second burst, where it'll open and then close after 5 seconds. When it comes to things like that, that's where we need to be careful. So even if let's say you're doing still life photography at home, I had a woman not too long ago who came in. She was helping her friend who was opening a restaurant take photos for the Uber Eats app. And the way she was doing it was she had her kitchen create every plate. She then wanted to stage the photos to then take them, to then upload, so that way they could show off the food in the proper way. When it came to that, taking something with longer exposure would be better, because it's going to give all the definition to the food, show off the color really nicely, just make the food more desirable. If she were to do long exposure by just holding the camera in her hand and taking the photos, there's always going to be a natural shake that we have, or just an unsteadiness to it. The images become blurry. So tripods, monopods, even in this case, you could have set the camera on a ledge, and that still would have done a better job than if you were just to hold it and then get that little bit of shake. So long exposures are always recommended to be done with a tripod, a monopod, putting it on a shelf, just making sure the camera has stability and isn't being moved around. In this case, this photo is probably about 10 seconds that was open for. And with that, we can see the variations in the greens. There's a mist too that's coming off the water, and it's causing this kind of haziness over the greenery as well too, which is really nice. The shapes of the rocks have definition in the dark patches and in the parts that are closer to light. The moss has color. You can see the reflection off some of these rocks. Everything's heavily detailed. As well too, when the water is falling down, we have patterns. We can see the streaks that the water is taking, but then we also get this kind of fuzzy and haziness because water doesn't move in one linear path. It's kind of sporadic and moving everywhere else. So not only can we take an image that's quick and fast to freeze the image, we can also play with the long exposure aspects of a photo to bring out definition, to bring out color, to really show off the pictures a little bit better. I look at long exposure as a really nice way of taking a heavily detailed photo without necessarily needing to go into a Photoshop or a Lightroom and play with the saturation and the color of the photo. All of this would have been naturally coming out of a camera rather than processed and played with. So other things to keep in mind with shutter. So the bigger the number, the faster the camera's going. The slower the number, the slower the camera, or the lower the number, the slower the camera is going. When it comes to taking photos really fast, we're going to have a darker image overall. Now this is where, when we're playing with shutter priority, the camera will balance that out with its ISO and with its aperture. It's going to choose the best part for us so that we only need to focus on the speed. If we're doing manual control, that's where then we have to be aware of these things and think about, well, if I'm going to go darker or faster with my image, it's going to be darker. So I probably need to open up my iris or my f-stop on my camera to get more light into the camera. So that's that balance of shooting. The slower we go with the camera, the brighter it becomes because we're letting more light in for a period of time. So be aware of that as well too. The whole thing when it comes to manual control is balance. And again, we still have that little running figure. That's kind of the symbol of shutter, if you will. The faster we're going with speed, the more likely we are to freeze frame the image. The slower that we go, the more likely we are to have some sort of blur, haziness, or motion.
What would have been the setting for the hummingbird?
That would have probably been about 1/1000th of a second, probably a little bit faster, probably closer to like that 1 2,000th of a second. It's hard because it's a lot of trial and error, and sometimes what it comes down to too is like burst photography, where you're holding, there's a button on the camera that is for burst and timer drive mode. Drive mode lets you do one single frame, and then it also can let you take a burst shot of like 10 frames in 1 second. Typically the symbolage is like a bunch of squares stacked up on top of each other, and then like a little timer symbol as well too. You click on that button, and then you're able to choose which one you want it to be. But that would be a good one, especially when it comes to these high speeds, if it's animals or something else that you're taking. Let's see, so the waterfall photo is 1/10 on shutter priority. Let's look back at the waterfall. So it necessarily wouldn't have been 1/10 of a second. It probably would have been about 5 to 10 seconds that this was open for. Usually on the camera, there's 2 options. You can do the B setting, which is bulb, which usually means that it will be open for as long as you're holding it, or with one click, it'll stay open until you click again. The other thing too is that sometimes in the settings, you're able to change the shutter speed to be as long as you want. So you can set it to be 3 seconds open, 5 seconds open, 10 seconds open. For more detailed shots, especially something like this picture, where there's a lot of green and there's variations of the green color, it's not a flat image. So this would have probably been open, if I had to guess, for 5 to 10 seconds, just to get all this information into the camera. It's not 1/10 of a second, it literally would be like just the number 10 written on there. If we look at the chart that was on the other page, you can see that when you get past, or when you go lower into the brighter section from 1/15 of a second, you get to the 1, the 2, and then you can go even longer as well too. So hopefully that makes sense. But I probably would say that the waterfall photo was open for 5 to 10 seconds in order to get all that information. Hopefully that helps. Ask more questions if it doesn't. But when it comes to the bird, it probably would have been at least at 1/1000th of a second. Burst mode would probably have been turned on to make sure that, if you're taking 10 images, or if you're taking one picture, you're going to get, or if you're trying to shoot something, you're going to get 10 pictures of that one thing, and out of the 10, one of them should be perfect. Why use shutter priority mode? I like this picture a lot. This was somebody, a mom or a dad who sent me this. Their kid plays ultimate frisbee. Shutter priority would be perfect for something like this. There's light that's coming from all of the street lights in the background of the photo. It looks like it's a little bit later in the day, maybe midday or nighttime. However, the camera that they had was still able to pick up a good amount of light. Their shutter speed wasn't set properly on this, and a lot of their images came out and looked like this. So just changing the speed, playing with that, trying to figure out what the best speed is for the event you're at. There's no one answer. You could probably get away with 1/500th of a second, but you also might need to do 1/2000th of a second, or 1/1000th of a second. It kind of just depends on the feel and the give of the situation. Plus it also matters or depends on what your aperture is at. Now if you're using shutter priority mode, the only thing you're concerned about is the speed at which your camera's firing. The camera then will adjust its aperture and will adjust its ISO to then help you get the best possible picture. So shutter priority, a good time to use it might be for when you have sports or action photography, something where you're not necessarily worried about the foreground and the background being separated or put together. You're more concerned about the clarity or the speed at which the image is being taken.
But then it plays into like the lighting, right? Because it's darker, and
Yes.
if it's at night, then it becomes.
that's where then shutter priority plays with ISO. And ISO is the third part of this whole thing. So aperture, foreground to background separation, how much light the camera brings in. Shutter speed is the speed at which it's firing. The faster, the darker, the slower, the lighter. The third part that then brings this whole thing together is ISO or ISO. The way to look at this is if you ever shot with film photography ever in your life, you'd get a box that say a Kodak and it would say Kodak 100 or Ilford 300, 400. That is the sensitivity to light that the film emulsion has. What engineers, scientists, and people who get paid a lot more than I do figured out was that you could take that property, that exposure property, and put it into a digital sensor. By doing that, now I can dictate on the fly what I want my sensor to be. So back before, you bought a pack of Ilford 100 film, you load it up into your camera, you were shooting with 100 ISO the whole time. All you had the choice of doing was shutter and aperture. Now, the camera has every single one of these built into it, and you can customize and play with it as much as you want. This is the other balance of the shutter and the aperture. ISO is the third part of this whole triangle, which brings it all back together. When we set our ISO, what we're doing is we're setting our camera for light sensitivity. In the manual world, let's say that we know the object is moving, we don't care about the foreground to background separation, it's a little bit dark, then we probably want to go with a higher number ISO so it pulls as much light from all the corners of my image as best as it can. Now let's say we're in the bright sunlight, it's a hot June day, there's not a cloud in the sky, we're taking photos maybe of our dog, and they're not moving, they're just sitting, they're being good. 100 ISO is probably a good option for us to use. We can keep our aperture nice and wide open to really get a good portrait of the animal, but we can rely on the fact that the camera is allowing more light to come in. Shutter speed really doesn't matter, and the only reason aperture would matter is if you care about that foreground to background relationship. That is where photography starts to now really get tricky because there is no one answer on that photo. You know, if I take a picture of my atrium right now, I probably could go as high as 800 and still get really good quality out of the image without making it too bright. I probably could also turn it down to 100, make it a little more moodier, still pick up good information, but keep it where it's not overly dark or overly light. There's a lot of play with this. This is the same image taken 4 times, ISO being turned up every single time, and you can see the information that becomes more clear as you get to the 800. Right underneath here, where the shadow is hitting the water from the dock above, you've got the sandy beach, the ripples in the water, and then you've got the sky, which is a little bit muted, and then as you move up to 800, this feels more of a rainbow spectrum of color. That beach is very solid, and you can tell what it is. It's not just a dark mass. The shadow underneath the bridge is still clean, but it's still dark, and we can really see the ripples and the reflection in the water. So by changing our ISO, we should, if depending on the situation, setting we're in, should get more light pulled into the camera, giving us an either clearer, darker, moodier, more dramatic image. It just kind of depends on what we are after. Another example of ISO, 5 of the same image. However, you can see that it was an overcast day, not a lot of sun. The sun that was coming through created a beautiful rainbow. And in that case, we're able to then see the transition from a 100 all the way to 1600. With ISO, it just doubles the number every single time. So you start at the 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, and it goes higher and higher from there too. ISO and noise, though, come together. This is where now it gets a little bit tricky. You might be very tempted to turn your ISO all the way up and start shooting with little to no consequence or thinking that there might not be any consequence. Well, if we go too much ISO, the camera will get what's called noise or blur. And usually it kind of reminds me of the static on your TV. So that's where the battle comes into play. If I turn my ISO too high, I'm giving myself more light, I'm giving myself more sensitivity to light, but now I'm running the risk of getting a photo that just doesn't look right. If we go too low with our ISO, then we're running the risk of not getting enough light, therefore leaving it dark or blurry or a few other slew of different things. In this case, we can see that at 100 ISO with what the sun is there, I believe that's the Empire State Building, we have a clean image. Empire State or Chrysler? I think it's the Empire State. With a noisy image, we can see at 3200 that it's very similar in quality and in texture. However, it's much noisier on the 3200 side because it's too much ISO. Now, one of the things you'll notice in modern mirrorless cameras, which still can happen in this case, is that when we change the ISO and we go too high, typically we'll get a lot more white or kind of the shock of white where the color just doesn't look right at all. That's the risk you run when you do too high of an ISO on the mirrorless cameras. But this is kind of what you'll be expecting to see. Now, in that terms, because we talked about why shutter priority, aperture priority, but ISO. There is no ISO priority. Instead, we call it automatic ISO. And all of your cameras can actually do it right off the bat. And I personally think that it's a setting that you should just leave on at all times. I think it's a good one to have because what's really nice is you don't have to sit there and think about the sensitivity. These new modern cameras, these mirrorless cameras, have really good sensors on the inside. They're really able to read light well. So I don't think it's necessary all the time to have your ISO turned on to manual control where you're constantly readjusting and setting it. I just don't think that you need to do that. However, I did get asked when I would use this if it were me. I had a mom come in here one day who was getting ready for prom season for her kids. She knew that they were going to take pictures at a friend's house, but they were also going to go to a country club and take pictures in front of a garden or waterfall section. So she was going to be indoors and outdoors. The indoors, there were 16-foot ceilings, not the best lighting on the inside. Outdoors, beautiful sunny days, so lots of sun, lots of light. Instead of making sure that she switched between both sides, she just kept it on auto. The camera then did the work for her, processed the light, and all she had to worry about was the other side of the manual control, which was shutter and aperture. Which in that case, shutter probably doesn't matter because she's taking still photos of the couples as they're getting ready for the dance. Aperture probably matters because they would either want to get, the background of wherever their photo shoot's at, or to get, a blurred out image, that way it was just a beautiful portrait of them. But that's when I recommended to use auto ISO because she was going to be bouncing between two different locations with very different light patterns and schedules. To bring it all back in before we talk about a few other things, aperture is going to be the control of the iris of your camera. The higher the number is in aperture world, the more of the background and the foreground that we see. The smaller the number is, or the closer to maximum aperture that we're at, the more of the background will become blurred, and the more we focus on our main subject matter in the portrait. So in this case, we have our two little pigs that are sitting on the couch. Below that, we have shutter. The faster we use the shutter, the better off of an image we're going to get where we freeze frame or slow down movement. So 1/1000th of a second, we can see the hammer and the fist in perfect clarity. As we start to make that slower though, we start to get blur on certain aspects of the photo until we get to half a second, and the board and nail are the only two pieces that make any sense because obviously they're not moving at all. The hand is now a blurry mess that we can't make or recognize. ISO, similar boat to these guys. The lower the number, the more or the less sensitive to light that we're making it. So in this case, we have a penny and we have what seems to be a black stain of wood or some sort of block or some sort of, board. Anyway, at ISO 100, given the settings and the light, we can see the penny and the wood with little to no noise, no discoloration, nothing that's washed out or looks fake. As we move up, 2500 ISO, we can't even read the penny, the scent anymore. And then the wood also feels like it's going away or it's turning into mush because of how much noise and blur is on the photo. So all three of these things are separate, but they all come together to form the manual control of the photo. And that's really what we're trying to hit at today, is learning how to either control one of these independently from the other settings, so that way you just get to use whatever it is you need to take your image, or mastering all three at the same time and just having full control over your camera and the knowledge to go with it. Kind of what we're after. Other things to keep in mind as we're going. Exposure meter. So exposure meter is a little different from ISO. ISO is the sensitivity of light towards our camera. The exposure meter is more so going to be our ability to take the whole frame and make it lighter or darker just based on that. The way to look at this is if you ever used film photography and you got into a, let's say, a light room, where now you're getting ready to expose your negatives and then put them onto a big piece of paper, you're using an enlarger. The longer we leave that open for, typically the darker or more saturated the image becomes. The less amount of time we leave it open on the enlarger, the lighter or less exposed the photo comes. It's a similar boat in this. Positive numbers or plus numbers will make the image brighter. Negative numbers will lower the exposure, making it darker. And if you're confused on what that really looks like or means, switch to Program Auto. That'll be the first place that you're able to use a setting like this and experiment with it. You should see it on the bottom of your screen or on the right-hand side of the screen. There should be a portion that shows exposure. And just by lowering it or raising it and staring either through the viewfinder or at the LCD screen of your camera, you should be able to see clear as day the image get darker or lighter depending. And I like this one specifically because Nikon and Canon do theirs differently. So does Sony, Fujifilm, Leica, Olympus, all of these different brands use exposure a little bit differently, but in the same boat. If you're a brand new user to any of these cameras and you switch or you move from DSLR to mirrorless, you're not sure about staying within a certain brand that you already have, you can still use the camera almost completely to its complete functionality without being confused or lost. Because for the most part, every camera has this. Every camera has to have aperture, shutter, and ISO. So it's just making sure that you understand what they do. So when you do start messing around with it, you at least can figure out what you're doing right and maybe what you're doing wrong. Light metering, again, another complex setting on the camera that you can play with, but you don't have to. I like to play with light metering depending on what I have going on. If I'm taking a photo or I'm doing a photo shoot, I look at where my existing light is coming from. And then I usually change my sensor to have that I then change that on my sensor to be what's going to best help my image. Every brand does it a little bit differently. You never have to touch this. Most people don't. But if you really get into it, you can play with it and change it. Multi, which is pretty much the top row of this. Certain brands have different names. Nikon Matrix, Sony Multi, Canon Evaluative, Fujifilm Multiple, Lumex Multiple, Pentax multi-segment. Basically what this is doing is it's taking light from all corners of the image, the center of the image, every portion that's bleeding over one way or the other, and bringing that light into your camera as best as it can for you to take the image. Center looks at the light in the middle and what's radiating from it. There's a real famous painter, Caravaggio. He was very well known for when he painted that he would have these beautiful candles that would be lit in the portraits, and you could see the light radiating off the portrait. It was gorgeous. That's the way I look at the center weighted one. Is if you were to take a picture of a candle in a dark room, you're not just going to get the flame of the candle. You're going to get the light that's trickling off of the flame that then brings luminance to whatever else is around. That's what center weighted does. It takes whatever light is directly in the center and then gets that little extra around. On the flip side of that, spot only comes from the center portion of the sensor, so it'll have a little bit of incorporation with that, but typically it's going to find whatever that source of light is directly in the middle, do its best to get that, and then darken everything from the sides. So that's just more of a moodier shot that you can take, something that by switching that will lend you to get something that might be dramatic or moody or expressionist, whatever it is that you're trying to do, maybe that's a little more artsy rather than just trying to be practical. Does everybody use this? No, not necessarily. I can't remember the last time I really changed light metering, but I do change it specifically usually if I'm doing a vacation shoot of some sort. I love traveling the world, so I'll go to cathedrals, I'll go to other places. The lighting in there can be so dramatic, and you can see that with your human eye, yet when you try to use a camera, sometimes it takes too much light in, and you're missing out on that dramatization of what's available to you. White balance is another thing to look at. I have this, then I have the histogram, which will kind of explain it a little bit better. But think about it this way. There is white in almost every photo that you take outside, or just in general. White is a common denominator in almost every photo unless you're taking a picture in pitch black darkness. For the most part, your white balance is set to auto. However, at any point in time, you can go through and customize this and change things. If you know that you're going to be in incandescent lighting or fluorescent lighting, change it. If you know you're going to be in direct sunlight, they should have a setting for that. Cloudy or overcast, natural shade, presets that you change yourself. There's a lot of different things within light or white balance that you can play with. But the idea is that color is measured on a scale, color temperature is measured on a scale for Kelvin. The more light or shadowy a picture is, the more blue it tends to be. As it then moves, it becomes more red, orangey. And that's the natural progression of the color going from one way to the other on this.
So is the auto on this sufficient,
Yeah,
or?
it is. But that's where you get to play with it a little bit. And I think that's something, don't get hung up on it. So if it's something where you take, here's the one thing I will say with any of it, and this goes for anybody at home watching too. One of the things with all of this stuff is that it's one thing for me to say it, it's another thing for you to go home and test it and experience it. Typically what I tell customers or people who are brand new into things, take a still life. Set up something that's shiny, something that's matte, something that has a reflection, something that has volume to it, and arrange it however you want on a table. Get a tripod, put the camera on there, take a picture, go into the settings, change something, take the same picture. I do that with every lens that I buy, with every new camera I get. I usually set up a still life and I take about 50 to 60 photos to really understand how is my camera processing what it sees in front of it, and I look for the nuances and the difference between them. That's a really easy way of you basically not having to sit there and listen to all these other people and what their opinions are, and you seeing it firsthand. A lot of people come in, they know what camera they want to get, or they understand what camera they can afford, whatever it might be, but then they don't understand what all can this thing do. And there's no one answer for any of it. Auto white balance is probably more than enough for what you need. But if you're, let's say, in an area and you've got, like for example this, we have canned recessed lighting where the light goes up, it's coming down, it's creating harsh shadows all over the place. If I put my hands out like this, I've got 2 shadows underneath me on this side, 2 on this side. Everything has multiple because of how goofy this lighting is. That being said, we're probably closer to the incandescent lighting. My camera on auto would probably do just a fine job at taking a photo, but if I want to, I can switch this up and give myself a little bit more of a bluescape to this to then help me get more out of the image, if that makes sense. When I have too much of this, changing might help balance it out. Where auto, in the similar boat of how your autofocus works, or your automatic setting works, right? The camera's going to do what it thinks is best. Is the camera always right? No. Are you always right? Also no. But that's that balance, that play through that you do. So hopefully that.
Yeah.
Awesome. It's a lot of information, so I appreciate you hanging in there. Full manual, though, is really what the main goal of any of this is. Now, again, do you always have to use full manual? No. It can be a pain in the butt. If you're not into all of this and all the controls and everything else, and you're just trying to use the camera for XYZ purposes, I'd recommend a priority mode. Give yourself the flexibility and ability to change settings on the camera, but don't overwhelm yourself in the sense that you're just going to be like, I'm going to master this if I keep doing it. Sometimes it has the reverse effect, and people get more tired of their camera because of all the extra stuff that they have to do. It's a lot easier to leave it in automatic and let it do its course and work. It's still going to take a really great photo, and depending on the quality of camera you have, it should be better than any cell phone that's out there. But it's kind of just what is your MO, or what is your goal from it, and how can you accomplish that? Full manual control, while it's great, might not be for you. One of the aperture shutter priorities might be better. But play with it, get a feel for it, and when you feel comfortable enough, try to switch to full manual, especially when you feel like you've mastered what a shutter speed and aperture can look like and figured out the key differences and what you need to do to take the best pictures. So now let's look at some of the images that I have on here. I'm going to just talk really quickly through these, and then I have a few more slides about, I believe, some more about content creation before then I open the floor up to general questions. Right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a few different slides. We're going to talk about ISO, shutter, and aperture, and what I see from my point of view, being that I've been taking photos for a very long time. So we have a cityscape or a landscape of some sort. We've got buildings in the background. We have a kind of center point in the middle of this where we have a bridge that's kind of taking us across whatever this is. If we think about it, we start with aperture. The foreground and the background are in good, clear condition. So I probably would say this is a higher number, something closer to maybe like an f16, maybe f22, but probably closer to f16. Now that's not going to let a lot of light in. It is a night sky or a darker sky, so we're probably going to turn our ISO up a little bit higher, probably somewhere close to 3200, if not 6400. And there is a lot of ISO on this because you can see how bright the lights in the windows of the buildings look. They almost are just too much, very pungent, very bright. Also, if you look under the beams, you can see a little bit of haziness or a little bit of noise. So that's there too. And as far as shutter is concerned, there's not a lot moving. We want to let in more light, so we're probably going with a slower shutter speed to help balance out the dark, the aperture, and the ISO. So we're probably somewhere closer to, let's say, 1 and maybe 250th of a second at the fastest. I probably would say like 1 and 100th of a second or 1 and 60th of a second. Next we have cherry blossoms. We can clearly see that there are 2 or 3 branches in the very front that are in focus, while the rest is in the background and blurred out. However, it's not blurred out to the point where you can't make out that those are just more cherry blossoms in the background. So f-stop or aperture on this is probably closer to an 8, maybe a 6, but probably more in that middle range, so that way we can blur the background out enough to keep our main couple branches in focus, but without losing the fact that it's just more trees full of cherry blossoms. Our light source is pretty good. It's direct sunlight. There's no overly cast shadows on this. I probably would say it's ISO 100. And as far as shutter is concerned, unless there's a violent wind blowing these branches around, probably would say 1/250th of a second is the lowest that this would be. Here we have 2 firemen, one in the background, one in the foreground. The one in the background is blurred out a pretty significant amount, but similar to the dogs that we looked at in the beginning of the slides, this looks like as if the background isn't blurred out enough that I can't make out if that's another fireman. So I probably would say this is a little bit higher than an 8, maybe a 10 or 11 for the f-stop, where again, blurred out, can't see where his eyes are, but we can tell it's another fireman behind them. As far as the ISO is concerned, this is probably going to be a little bit higher, just given how harsh and dark the shadows are underneath the helmet, and how orangish or on the kind of iridescent side of Kelvin, that is. So I probably would say that ISO is somewhere around, let's say 800, maybe 16, but probably not. Probably say 800. And shutter speed, in this case, I still think will be low. We want to make sure we get as much detail off these guys. There's not a lot of noise in this photo. However, unless they're walking really fast, I probably would say it's ISO 100, or shutter is 1/100th of a second, maybe 1/250th of a second. Again, those numbers are typically pretty average in the camera world when it's something that's not moving a lot. It won't pick up your shake of your hand. However, it's fast enough that it won't not let a lot of light in. The ram's head. Now this one, I feel like there's a few different things going on. As far as aperture is concerned, we're definitely closer to that 5 to 6 range, possibly a 4, just because of how blurred out the background is. You can definitely tell that's snow or some sort of gravel or something's behind it that's cold. You got the ram, great detail on the ram, really nice clean photo. Aperture is probably aperture, yeah, oh, with the background being set, sorry, I'm jumping steps. Aperture wise, I'm probably, I already said that, I'm looking at a 4 to 6. ISO, there's not a lot of light, but there's a good amount on this. It's very dramatic and moody given kind of how that shadow is under the horns and how that plops on the face by the eye. So I probably would put this at a 400. And shutter, again, there's a lot of detail in this image, unless this is a moving animal, which I've had this debate with a couple customers. I think this is a stuffed animal of some sort, something like you'd see at the Field Museum. So I probably would say that this is a 1/100th, maybe a 1/60th of a second as far as the shutter speed's going. Now we have more movement, but we have movement, we have light, and we have good background blur. So if we think of it just at the start of aperture, we're definitely at a 1.4, 1.6, maybe even 1.2. The background is so blurred out, especially in that left image, you cannot tell what the background is other than more trees or grass, and those little sparkling areas with the red is probably some parked cars. This is a park of some sort. Same thing on this side. We have good shrubbery behind, but we can't really see the detail of it, but we can tell that there's something there. But then both dogs are in complete focus on this one. ISO is probably going to be low because we have good direct sunlight. And you can see the harsh shadows underneath the dog kind of pitched to the left side. I probably would say that's ISO 100, maybe 200, but I think 100 would be more than enough. And then as far as the speed, this is probably 1/1500th of a second, 1/1000th of a second, around that realm. I imagine they would have done some form of burst photography in order to get these images, something to really slow the frame down, because again, with a dog, with any animal, with any bunny in general, if you're jumping and doing stuff like this, you're only in the air for maybe a second, maybe half a second. So keep that in mind, that these images we're probably taking as a burst photo, so that way they would freeze frame and we get the crispiness of the image. I mean, the dog on the right is so crisp on that. You can see the teeth, the paws, even the hair that's dangling off, nothing is blurred. Whereas the dog on the left, there's a little bit of motion blur on certain parts. I mainly see it on the little strands of hair that's on the dog. However, there could be nothing. So, I believe this is one of the last ones before we jump into the next part of the class. But this is a good example as well too. Sports, this is probably about that 1/1000th of a second for speed. Aperture, the background is slightly blurred but not too blurry. So I probably would say that this is going to be more of a f8, maybe f11, maybe a little lower than f8. However, just given the background blur on there, I don't think it was too much. And as far as shutter speed goes, he broke a tackle. He probably ran from one side to the other. So I would probably say that 1/1000th of a second is good for this. Maybe even faster. Learning your camera is only the start. Anyone can learn to use a camera. My classes, my resources are a great start. But I can tell you guys all this stuff until I'm blue in the face. It really comes down to you going out and practicing and trying it out. Like I kept saying in the beginning, like I keep saying now, there is no one answer to what makes the photo the best. It really is trial and error. It's you setting up a still life at home, taking 10 or 15 photos of the same thing and discovering how your camera reacts and what you think is the best. It comes down to going out to a field, going to an event, going on vacation, failing a little bit as you're going, and then realizing what mistakes you made and how to fix those. That's truly the best way to learn how to use this guy. There are little tips and tricks here and there. However, nothing can beat trial and error, especially in the photography world. And the nice part is this isn't film, so if you screw up, you can just delete it. Which, I mean, I still shoot on film here and there, and oh man, every time I get a bad roll, I get really upset. Best camera accessories that really don't involve money, or might, but depending. Practice being number one. Go out, take photos. When I was in college, I would go grocery shopping. I'd get out of school, I'd have my camera with me. I'd take pictures inside the grocery stores. I liked how products would be lined up. I'd get the depth of field of like 10 boxes of just cereal packed behind them. I thought it was fascinating. Those photos were stupid, and every time I look at it, it makes me laugh a little bit that I took the time to do all that. However, it was great practice, and I'll never forget those days. Classes are great. My class is completely free. There's tons of other classes out there. I was told that Oakton has really great adult classes where you don't actually get any college credit, but it's college professors teaching people who want to learn photography. YouTube is also one of my favorite resources. I recently built a bathroom in my house, and I learned how to do it on YouTube. Workshops are great too. I have a couple of people who they do workshops out of the Chicago Botanical Gardens, where they'll be with people who are like-minded in photography, and they just kind of work with each other and bounce ideas off. But it's a perfect environment because you get something that looks staged with flowers, with lighting, blooming, and you really can get some beautiful photos out of that. Travel is then the next thing I'll tell you. I mean, it sounds like a no-brainer, but if you're leaving the state going somewhere, I know it's an extra piece of equipment you bring in with you, but bring your camera with you, take some photos. If not for anything, do it for yourself so you have memories of you going someplace, bringing that with, and getting cool pictures. Travel also makes and kind of forces you to learn how to do it, because if you screw up and you miss the shot, you're going to kick yourself that you did. So it's that little bit of extra kick in the butt to make you just, practice and focus on what you're taking pictures of. If I really had to sell you on stuff, I'm going to tell you the top 4 are the most necessary products you should be getting. Get a bag, protect your camera. You spent all this money on it. Make sure you're having good housing or protection around it so that way nothing gets damaged in transport or when you're doing stuff. Have an extra battery and an extra memory card. It happens to me all the time where I won't take all the photos off my memory card, and now I've run out of space. At least I had an extra one with me to then get those images. An extra battery too as well. If you forgot to charge your camera the night before, at least you've got something to throw in there and start taking pictures. It would be a shame if you spent all this money on a vacation or you're taking photos for a professional shoot. You get there and I gotta wait 45 minutes while my camera charges. Give me a second. It's probably not the best. A lens cleaning kit. Do not use your sweaters or your t-shirts to clean your lenses off. I'm a fellow four-eyeser myself with my glasses. They come with little microfiber cloths. You can use the same thing on your lens. They make really nice cleaning kits with isopropylactic spray where you can just clean the lens and polish it off. It goes a long way. If you keep using shirts and sweaters, it won't be the first time, won't be the second, won't be the 10th time. But 500 wipes with your sweater later, and the lens is going to get little scratches on there. Eventually, your focus won't work properly. You're not going to be able to capture the image as crisp as it was when you first bought it. Take care of the lenses. The lenses is, without a lens, there is no photography. So it doesn't matter what camera body you have, the lens is everything. And a strap is important as well too. I have quick release straps that I use from Peak Design. So if I don't want the strap on, I can click it off and just have the camera. But have a strap, keep it around your neck. It's easiest if you pull from the neck because then it's always there, it's always ready to shoot. Tripods are great too if you need the stabilization. I definitely recommend them. An external hard drive is fantastic as well too. Helps you save all your photos, not just congest your laptop full of thousands of photos. Polarizing filters, ND filters, I won't get into those details right now. If you have questions, ask me about them. I'm more than happy to answer them. But filters go a long way on your camera, and it's not a bad option to get those. And additional lenses would be the next thing I'd say. Start with the kit lens. I can't tell people enough that buying a kit lens for your camera is not a bad move. You're not going to regret it. For a lot of new photographers that get into this, they're like, I don't know what I want to take photos of, I just know I want to take photos. And that's great, but sitting there and listening to your friend recommend this lens or this lens or this lens might be overwhelming and might make you kind of reconsider this whole thing. If you just go in, you buy a camera body that you can afford with a kit lens, it's a good starting, jumping off point for then you to learn, okay, I want to take more photos like this, so maybe I should get a lens that helps me do this. I've got guys who come in and they're like, I want to be a landscape photographer and that's what I'm doing in my free time. And then 2-3 weeks later they come in and they're like, yeah, I want to take pictures of bugs. I'm like, okay, that's weird, but sure. There's like all sorts of jumping off points with it, and there's a lens that fits for all different sorts of needs. So additional lenses will be the last one that I have for you. And I believe that is all I have. So that was the intermediate camera. Tried to keep it around an hour for you guys. Now we'll do questions for the last 30 minutes. Next Thursday is advanced. That's where we're going to talk more about photo editing and then some tips and tricks to taking a really clean photo, as well then too about, what's the term? Videography and content creation. A lot of people nowadays are opting to not pay for photographers or people to come in and do videos for companies or for their own things. In that class, we're going to talk a little bit about what you should know to help make a production or to keep things looking really clean and proper for whatever it is you're trying to do. My phone number, email's there. If you don't feel comfortable contacting me or asking questions now, email me, call me, whatever you need.
Thanks.
Of course. What questions do you have for me?
Well, this probably is more specific to the camera that I have, but you can, from what I read, you can set like the aperture as like the main priority.
Yeah, pull your
But
camera. I can
then
show you.
the other ones you can set a range, correct?
That's more for your ISO or your shutter would be the range.
Would be the range.
Yeah, because for the most part, depends on the camera that you have. But for aperture, typically, it's either the camera's going to manually control it based on the setting, or it's going to do it for you, or you're going to do it for the camera, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, right now you're on the program auto mode. So that's going to give you the flexibility to make a couple different changes on. So that's going to give you the flexibility to change a couple things. So if I turn this on and I click the Q button, that's like your shortcut menu for changes.
Okay.
If, let's say, we go back to automatic
Okay.
and I click the Q button again, out of this. See how that goes away? It gives me basically none of those same options anymore because auto doesn't want you to do that. Auto wants you to basically point, shoot, take a clean image. P is still automatic, but it's program automatic. So now, if I click on the Q button, I can make those changes. So autofocus area, where am I gravitating towards? Am I just focused on the middle of my frame? Do I want to get the outsides, like outskirts of the image? That's what all of those options on the bottom line.
Okay.
We rotate through. That's then our one-shot servo. This is for focusing. So if we want, we can let the AI kick in on the camera. Again, these cameras are very intelligent. Servo is like your continuous autofocus. That's what I usually set my cameras to, but you can choose whatever you like. Under that, you have image quality. So you have it set to RAW right now, which is great if you're editing photos. If you're not editing photos, a JPEG would be more than sufficient, and it'll still take a really clean, nice image. That's that drive mode button I was telling you about. If you want to get something that's faster or one shot or timed images, you have all that right there.
Okay,
Metering mode, light metering.
okay.
Flicker, this is interesting, so it's effects of light. This is something that's specific to Canon. You can play with this and experiment with it, but technically if there's light that's bleeding in and it's kind of awkward in your images, the light flicker should help reduce that. Auto white balance, which we talked a little bit about. Picture style, that's more just for fun, but you can set it so it's black and white image or highlight certain colors. The camera can deduce that and really do some awesome stuff there. Subject detection. So you can set it to be auto, humans, pets, cars, there's a lot you can play with.
So, but, okay, so we're going on, I had a Nikon before, so this is like,
That's a
everything is in a
Yeah.
different spot, it's like a little overwhelming. And it was the DSLR,
Yeah.
and so it's just a lot of changes. But in August, we're going on a safari.
Sure.
So that's my goal,
Yeah.
is to get to a place that I can use it when we go
Yeah.
away. But with all of those settings on the bottom for detection,
Sure.
like if I'm taking a picture of my parents and then I go to take pictures of the animals or.
You can set it to auto. The other thing though too is like, I mean for me, I change the camera continuously as I'm going. So I will constantly go into the
I
menu.
just gotta learn where
And that's
everything
the key.
is. Okay.
If you really want to have a good understanding of it and get the best pictures, as sad as it is to say, the only way to do it truly is just to practice and remember, okay, I clicked Q, let's switch over to animals. Oh, now my parents are over here, switch over to Q, let's get human detection. You
Okay.
can keep it auto. So on here, if we go and I click that Q button, they had it where subject can be auto and it can just
Okay.
detect anything.
Okay.
Whatever's closest it'll pick up on. You can set it to that too.
Okay.
When you're shooting, the TV and the AV are going to be your aperture priority mode and your shutter priority mode. I don't know why Canon does TV. Some just do S, some do SV.
Okay.
No clue. That would be fun too. So like if you're in an area and you see like, you know, the cheetahs running through, you might want to switch to shutter priority and then just focus on the speed of the shutter, let the camera do the rest, but that way you're controlling how fast you're getting that image.
Okay.
If you don't care about that, and let's say it is just your parents that you want to get a clean picture of, AV might be a good option too. You play with the aperture.
Okay.
But I would start with the green, start with automatic. Get a feel for framing images up, taking clean pictures. Once you feel comfortable with that, I then move to the P. Play with then the ability to change settings on there that won't make or break the image, but it'll give you a little bit of variation between different things.
Okay.
When you start feeling more comfortable with that, then I would pick between aperture and shutter, and then just play around with that. If you feel really comfortable with all that by the time August comes around, give manual a shot. You might like it, but for the average Joe, for most people, for myself even too, I use aperture priority more than anything. I control the relationship between my background and my foreground, how much light I'm letting in, what subject I'm focusing on. But then I might go through and make slight changes, like okay, I want to focus on the center of my image, or I want to get the whole image if I'm doing group shots, or you know, pictures of people in events. I do a lot of charity work and non-for-profit stuff, and 80% of the battle is me being in these like banquet halls while they're doing some sort of fundraising event or everything else, and I'm taking pictures of 3 or 4 people socializing. Or the one I do is for an animal shelter. I'll take a picture of 5 or 6 dogs playing. That's where then aperture priority for me works the best because of what I'm doing. Now, if I spend a day with them and we're doing something where the animals are really running around, or you know, I did my cousin's track meet last year, then I might go to TV because now I have speed and I'm trying to get good motion on the shot so it doesn't look blurry or pixelated. Just a balance.
Okay.
But I would start with the automatic.
Okay.
Keep it simple for
I'll play
yourself.
with that, yeah.
Move to P when you're feeling more comfortable with it. You're going to get the same things on automatic. You can even start on P and not touch any of the buttons quite
No,
yet.
I know how to use that, like,
Yeah.
I know enough, but it's, I just don't know where anything is on it.
For sure. And I think what you should start by doing is starting out with one of them. As you have issues and you're like, what the hell is that? Write it down, and then that's where then it probably would be better for us then to talk, because then I can give you jumping off points for
Okay.
like what to do with that or how to go about that.
Okay, perfect.
Anything else you want to ask?
No, I think that's it.
You are a beautiful camera. I love the R6 Mark II. Is fantastic.
Well, I did a lot of research, right, and I figured, I think it's, was looking for that next camera, cause
Yeah.
I kind of grew out of the other one, and I felt
Sure.
like, but I know this is more than what I know, cause it's got a lot more bells and whistles to it. But going from the Nikon to the Canon, I didn't anticipate, like, just a big switch, right?
It's tough. It takes a little bit of time. But the one thing I do tell people all the time is like, it's a big switch, it's a change, but it's still the same kind of
It's
camera
still-
that you remember.
And the whole philosophy is still the same.
Exactly. But now it's just figuring out where things are. Do they matter to you once you find out where they are located? Because there might be a thing on there, again, the bells and whistles where you're like, oh, I don't need that.
Right.
And that's the one thing I do like about modern cameras nowadays is that they've simplified them enough where you just want a good image, you can buy a great camera and take a clean image, not have to think twice about it. But then they have it where you want to master it and really have like a, I have one of my cameras is only manual focus. It's a Leica, great camera, love it. I can focus manually faster than most of my cameras can autofocus, and I pride myself on that, how quick I am with it. But it's because I've practiced and I've used it, and I've studied it, and I've messed around with it.
Actually, that's the other question. Okay, so this is like, I know what this
Yes.
dial is, but then there's the middle one, and then there's this
So
one.
typically the way that these cameras work is that that's your zoom,
Right,
that's your focus, this is what you'd call your control ring. In the settings for Canon's unique with this. They allow you to play around and mess with whatever you want this to be. So when you're manually controlling your camera, typically you're controlling the things with the rings. So here's like one of the rings, there's one of the rings,
Right.
this is one of the rings. In the settings, you can now dictate and say, I want this to be one of the rings. Some people prefer that because when they're using their camera, if this is how you're shooting, well now you have it kind of like a guitar where you're playing with the strings. I can switch this, or switch this, come back, move that again. It's that quick, easy.
So when you say it controls something, what does it control?
It can control your shutter speed, it can control the aperture on there, you could have it set for exposure compensation, ISO, anything around that nature. It's not gonna obviously do like your focusing for like.
Well, no, because you're using autofocus for the most part.
Yeah, and if you're using manual focus, this would be the one
That's
that
the
you'd
one.
use.
Okay. It was the end one that was throwing me because I
Yeah.
couldn't figure out what it was.
There's adapters, so like for example, if you came from the old Canon system, the DSLR system, you could bring those lenses over to this camera.
Yeah, I saw that.
And what they do is they actually sell an adapter that is basically that big, and it has that ring on there. So when you put that on, now that's now a ring you can control.
I thought the adapter went onto the camera itself.
It does.
Oh,
Yeah, it
got
would go
it.
in the front. It would go in the back
Oh,
end of
yeah.
it. It's just basically if I were to chop
The
that
same
part
thing.
off and move
Got
that
it.
down, that's what it
Okay.
would look like. So,
Okay.
but yeah, that's all this ring is. If you go into the settings, let's see, it's menu. Let me just see if I can find it for you. Control. I believe it's under the quick controls where you can set and change things. If you click on customize quick controls, you should then find a section under there that will talk about the control link and what you can then customize and set that to. Again, you don't have to use it, you can really just ignore it. Overall,
I think it's a little much for me right now. Let me figure out everything else.
this is one of their top of the line lenses. This is a f4 continuous, so you're not going to get down to 2.8 or 1.4, but you're going to let a lot of light in if you want to. 24 to 105 is a good range for walking around street street photography, but then also if you need a little extra distance to see something. When it comes to the safari in August, what I would probably do is keep practicing with this. You might want to get a bigger, not bigger, but like a longer zoom lens.
I did.
Awesome.
So I bought, it's the basic one. It's the
Okay.
100 to
Oh,
400.
beautiful. That's a great lens.
But, because I did a lot of research on that one too, and people are saying that it's not a professional one, but
No.
it's like, it does a lot for what it is. And I was debating about getting whether or not I wanted the 1.4.
Top converter.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can, with the 100 to 400, can you use the top converter on there?
I watched a video on
Yeah,
YouTube and
did
I
it?
think
Okay.
he had it on there.
Certain lenses are compatible, others aren't. I can't
I'm
remember off the top of my head.
90% sure that it was.
Yeah, that's great. And I think the settings for that, a lens like the 100 to 400 would be perfect because you're going to get days where the sun is just very intense and bright. That 100 to 400 will not allow for a lot of light to come in. So naturally having better natural light will help that lens out a lot. If you were to take that lens and take it indoors, you might run into some problems.
Okay.
But outdoor photography with natural lighting or with good lighting and distribution of that would be a great lens.
So you don't think it's gonna, well, is the I guess ultimately, yes, I want to get good pictures when I'm away, but ultimately, I'm gonna wind up here.
Yeah.
So
It's a
is
great,
it a good universal?
100%.
Okay,
Those lenses though usually brand themselves for more animal nature photography. Like you're not gonna bring a 100 to 400 to downtown Chicago, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
It's not, really the numbers won't equate to where you're at taking photos. Like this would be a much better lens for like downtown,
Mhm.
walking around. You're in museums or you're going to, something in the park, whatever it might be. But for those nature, like the safari, that's a great example of that because of the distance you'll be from other objects. You want that magnification. You go to Starved Rock National Park here in Illinois, then yeah, the 100 to 400 would be perfect for that. So would the 24 to 105. It's kind of use case scenario. But no, it's still a great lens. It's just what you're using it for might be why not to bring it or to bring it with you, depending
Okay.
on what you do.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, cause I'm not planning on buying another lens anytime soon.
100%,
It's like,
I need another lens like I need a hole in my head. I understand where you're at.
well, it's just one of those things, you spend all that money and it's like, okay, well, let's figure this out first,
Oh yeah.
that was the only thing is, because it frustrated me with my last camera, is
Yeah.
my lens, and we were just in Maui and I was trying to take pictures of
Yeah.
some whales. And there were some pictures I got that were amazing, where
Yeah.
the whales were somewhat close, but there were some that I was like, if I just had that longer lens,
Exactly.
if it was just a little bit.
That'll be that 104 perfect for that kind of thing.
Okay, but do I do the adapter thing or not?
Start with using it without the adapter.
Okay.
Get a feel for the focal length. What I usually do is those longer lenses. I go on my block and I'll try to zoom towards a stop sign or a sign
That's a
away
good idea.
and just feel for it. Remember too that you have a full frame camera. When you put those photos on the computer, you can crop in a good amount without losing quality of the image. So you've got a lot to play with on there. Start with that. If you feel like that's not enough distance from all the research you're doing, then yeah, get the 2 times 1.4 teleconverter, whatever you want. Try throwing it on there. Everything's a want in the camera world, and it's just kind of figuring out if you
I was even thinking about renting it,
Yeah, that's not
because
bad.
it was like $30 for 7 days, and so
Yeah.
for $60.
Yeah, why not? Exactly.
Because it's like a couple hundred or.
Yeah, it's a roughly, I think it's like 400 or 500.
Yeah, so I was
Yeah.
just thinking maybe I would just rent it.
I mean,
because-
if you can't think of use cases outside of that, but if you're doing a bunch of these trips, at least once a year, camera body's gonna last you a good 10 years. The lenses will last you forever as long as you take good care of it. It's very far and in between where I'm like, oh, I need to get a different lens. This one's starting to fall apart on me. So, having the teleconverter is not a bad idea, but it's just kind of thinking about how often do I need it.
Well, and the other thing is like switching everything out, cause if it's all dusty and everything, like.
lens cleaning kit though goes a long way for that stuff. Usually most of those have like a little plunger tool where it'll blow air, and especially when you pull this thing off.
That's my concern, right?
Yeah, it should be, but remember that this has the shutter on the inside to protect the sensor.
Okay.
So as long as you're turning your camera off every single time before you change the lenses, this is made to protect it.
Okay.
These are pretty durable. I usually set mine downwards like this. I never leave them up because that's how dust falls in. As long as the surface you're changing them on is somewhat clean like this, setting it down won't be a problem.
Okay.
But this saves you a lot.
Okay.
And if it doesn't, you get one of those lens cleaning kits. They're only $25-30. Just get a little bit of a larger bag and stuff it in there. They come with that little blow tool that just blow the air out, turn the camera kind of at an angle, and then I usually just that'll hold the dust.
What's this lock button on here for?
The lens. So if I want, I can lock it. Now I can't move that.
Oh, it's the.
Exactly.
Okay.
If you let's say you're taking pictures and you only need the 50, like, you know.
That's pretty rare.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
certain use cases it can be important. Like let's say just need 50 continuous. Oh no, that's not how this one works. No, this is literally a lock only for when you're traveling.
Oh, it is.
Yes. These aren't motorized zoom lenses. Therefore, technically when you're traveling, these could, in theory, kind of like move on you. And then as you're traveling, if this is exposed while it's in the bag, this is the most sensitive part. Like you can see how that wiggles.
Oh, yeah.
Too much force could literally snap this thing. I had that happen to me on a cruise. I got up from dinner table, had this thing around my neck, and caught the corner of the table and pulled up. My lens came out slightly. Still worked, but it was.
There was one other question that I had for you. The stabilization is on here, but
It's on
there
both.
is it automatically set on here? Okay.
Automatically set. Some people are using gimbals and other like motorized. Like this kit as a whole was created for video to make it easier to take good video, and so that's why the stabilizer is on the lens, because sometimes you only want it on the body. Other times people turn it off completely, and whatever the rig they have it set up on is what then gives you the stabilization. I wouldn't worry too much about that though. For your purposes, you can keep that on. The body automatically has it on too. You have to actually go in and turn it off.
Oh, you do? Okay, because I was trying to figure out where it was. I hadn't really looked yet.
Okay. Yeah, but yeah. Focus, trigger. If you're on automatic, click this, starts your video automatically. Play around with it, mess around, find out frustrating parts, write it down, and just ask away. I know.
The other day I was like driving myself nuts.
Oh yeah.
And I haven't really, I just bought it last week, and so I
Yeah, yeah.
really haven't had enough time to really play with it, so.
I have a couple customers of mine who will come back in to see me frequently, and it's like I have it on a set schedule. Like every 4 or 5 months, I hear from them.
Oh, really?
And it's the same thing because like life gets in the way. You get busy. You don't think about it. You put it down. Then all of a sudden you're like, oh no, did this work? I'm a little confused. And that's where then I get them and I'm like re-explaining the same 5 steps over and
Well,
over.
it's funny that you said that, because when I went away, I hadn't really used it much for like 8 months for whatever reason. And so I was definitely struggling at the beginning.
It takes a little bit. It definitely does. And I mean, like, that's the one thing too, is like, everybody kind of remembers when they were, shooting, how it works, how it functions, but then it is new, there's a lot of new bells and whistles, so it's like, yeah, I understand the main concept of the triangle and how, how these work. What is this? Why is this there? Every time I click this button, it's doing this. So you're back with training wheels a little bit on the camera, yeah.
That's kind of how I feel.
Yeah.
And it's kind of exciting, but it is a little frustrating. But
Start on the automatics, and I promise you, it'll clear itself up, because as you start playing with it more on automatic, it'll then kind of frustrate you. You're like, well, I wanted to do this, so how do I do this? And then you start playing with buttons, and it all clicks.
Okay.
But for now, let automatic be your best friend, and just worry about framing stuff up and practicing with what you have. The 100 400 is a good lens, though. I think Native Range is
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's a good camera for me?
100%. I mean, the R6 II, great
I didn't want
photo,
to,
video.
I figured the 5 was like above me, so,
I mean,
I didn't want to spend any
You're
money.
3 cameras away from the top of the line from Canon. So that's still that's a really powerful camera. So I would say that is great for your, not necessarily beginner, but like hobbyist into that almost. Yeah, I think that would be great. Yeah.
Okay.
So
All right.
enjoy,
Thank you.
ask
Thanks
questions.
so
and see how-
much.
Of course, thanks
I'll
for
see
coming.
you next week.
Yeah, I'll be here. All right, guys. Thanks for being here. I appreciate everybody asking questions. If you have anything in the future, please email, call me with whatever you have. My name is Saxon. I teach the camera classes here every Thursday. We'll be here next Thursday, which will be March 20th for our advanced camera class. March 20th, we'll talk a little bit about photo editing, taking clean, good photos, and a little bit more about content creation and accessories that'll help push that to the next level. So definitely come out for that. We have 2 more this month, that class and 1 other one, and then we will restart everything in April. Thanks, guys, for joining me. As always, keep taking photos, keep shooting, and I'll see everybody next week for advanced cameras on Thursday.